Namaskara. Today we are to start our fifth week of our sessions on sense of past towards realizing Rāma Rājya. Before we begin, let me start with a prayer. Namostu Ramaya Salakshmanaya Devyai Chatasya Janakatmajaye Namostu Rudra Indra Yamanilebhyo Namostu Chandraka Marutganebhyaha. The discussion that we have today is built on some of our exercises that we have done in the past 4 weeks. Specifically, in our previous session, there has been a reference to the idea of Rāma Rājya and something that goes beyond in terms of Swaraj of ideas that Professor Ramachandra Gandhi has conveyed in his lecture reflecting on Swarajin ideas of Professor Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya. So the idea that we'll begin is to look at, say, some of the points that he has referred to in his speech and build from there on the theme for this week, which is Pura Apinavam Puranam, Purana Vairam. There is a specific sense in which I see that this characterization is going to be built. First, let us look at the question of Puranam and the manner in which it has been stated. So the first task that I see in this formulation is to speak of the requisite sense in which we reckon that past is important or not. And when we say Pura Apinavam Puranam, the question has been to look at that which has happened long before in the past, but yet is something new as on today. So there is a specific sense in which we would notice right after India's independence, there was a call which was also quite popular, which went in the sense, Chodo kal ki baate, kal ki baat purani, naye daur mein likhenge hum, milkar nayi kahani, hum Hindustani. So in this formulation of the sense by which we start thinking about writing something afresh that is in no manner connected or related to the question of what happened of yore, has been a certain formulation which indeed has created a schism in terms of how we understand past. And there are quite a few instances that have actually increased this sense throughout. So my attempt in this specific session would be to narrate a few points that require to be captured on what is the sense in which Purana is to be understood, and in what manner shall we deal with that which is old, yet that is new? And how is it that this question has found an antagonism, and in what manner is this antagonism playing out as on today, which is one of the many reasons why we find that the reference to Rāma Rājya or a sense of any kind of utopia that goes back way back in time is something that is taken to be difficult to imagine right away. And there are certain concrete reasons why this happens. And at the outset, there is one reference that I can bring to your attention, that on this very day, as per the common calendar, 20th of March, about 70 plus years ago, no, about 100 years ago, yeah, about 90 plus years ago, there was a specific movement that Dr. Ambedkar led to a specific tank of water to consider, to actually project the sense of equality. He has gone up to the tank and has taken the waters of the tank, which was earlier stated to be out of bounds for the community from which he belonged to, which is that of Mahars. So that is commemorated today by many of our own brethren who call themselves as Dalits. So this is a reference that I do want you to be aware of, because there is a great degree of the sense of antagonism to that which happened in the past that has greatly to do with the kind of scenarios which either are properly understood or not properly understood, but certainly the senses in which a sense of past thus created has brought about a scenario where many people felt there isn't much to be captured of past that we need to see to be carried further into future. And this is not a story that limits itself to what Dr. Ambedkar and his disciples and his followers tried to portray, but it also finds, or it also got its own respective formulation in the book which was written in 1940 by one of the very senior and also an important Shastra scholar by name Tīrtha, Lakshman Shastri Joshi. Sri Lakshman Shastri Joshi, Pandit Lakshman Shastri Joshi, was also a very important figure in the modern India, because he comes from that kind of scholarly lineage which actually compiled the texts on Dharmashastras. And in fact, that project ran for almost, it's still running, it ran for 70 years under the stewardship of Pandit Lakshman Shastri Joshi. And this is the project which is known by the name Dharmakosha. And what was Dharmakosha's project about? As you would be aware, sometime in the past, all the kind of Dharmashastras, they were actually on manuscripts, and each of these manuscripts were found to be present from the, were actually found to be something that people carried by inheritance from their respective gurus, or they were inherited from one's own family. So because the nature of learning was by way of inheriting from a guru or by way of inheritance within the family, these manuscripts that were there, they actually were present with different scholars across the country, and there are different paramparas in which each of these are present, and with their consent some copies were made, and these copies were actually shared. And the exercise of Dharmakosha was to collect, collate, and also in such instances where there may be errors in copying, to put effort by bringing in scholars to revise it and also publish the corrected manuscripts. And this major exercise, you would find that, say, there must be at least 17 volumes last known that have been published under this project. And currently there is a state of lull because of lack of funding. But that project was started by the guru of Pandit Tarkatirtha, Lakshman Shastri Joshi. So this guru was Swami Kevalananda Saraswati Ji of Vai in Maharashtra. Tarkatirtha Lakshman Shastri Joshi Ji was also a close friend of M.N. Roy. M.N. Roy was one of the foremost communist leaders who later felt disillusioned with the communist unfolding, and he embraced, or rather formulated, what he called as radical humanism. And Tarkatirtha Lakshman Shastri Joshi Ji was heavily influenced by the radical humanism that was projected and that was proposed by M.N. Roy. So this Tarkatirtha Lakshman Shastri Joshi Ji has written a book in 1940, and he was a close associate of Mahatma Gandhi, and with respect to several of Mahatma Gandhi's positions on how should Shastra be understood, Pandit Lakshman Shastri Joshi Ji was a sounding board, and he was the one who as well gave him the manner in which these interpretations are to be done. And as a part of that, he has written a book called A Critique of Hinduism, within which he says that there is not much from the Dharma Shastras that requires to be carried forth to the future. And this particular critique goes on to criticize all that is existent. And it's a fine exercise to actually read through because of the extents of scholarship that one finds within this work, and also the manner in which one can see this as a critique that is embracing what we have seen was the move that Rabindranath Tagore suggested when he said embracing scientific nationalism. So the scientific formulation and the sense of rationale and reasoning to be grounding principle for every kind of thing that was of yore is something that is upheld. And in all such instances where this can be brought about, he has indeed brought to the fore the question of how can one indeed see this this point of wherever, say, there is an incident where one cannot reason it out, he has questioned it and said that possibly this was done to preserve the kind of sense in which one carries the inertia that comes from past. So this sense of inertia that was actually projected is a very important point that was brought to the fore, and that inertia needs to be shunned, and we need to have the confidence to not consider certain points which are not rational as we move forward. So such was the thrust of the critique of Hinduism. It's a different story that Pandit Lakshman Shastri Joshi Ji was also someone who went forward and found that 20 years post-independence, the sense of critique has resulted in such a state of affairs where there was no sense of appropriate maryada. So he wrote another book wherein he said the sense of what I meant by reasoning is something that should not be considered to mean that all that is of yore needs to be shunned, because there are many things that require to be savored, and they must be further say brought to attention to people. So this was a second exercise that was done. And further, you would also notice that Lakshmana Shastri Joshi was also very close to the formulation of the manner in which Indian post-independent India's Hindu Code Bill and the reforms that were done to Hindu law, all these had an imprint of the thoughts of Lakshmana Shastri Joshi ji and amongst others. So he was heading that kind of a group which actually thought of revising Dharmashastras that would indeed make them contemporary. So that way, the exercise of the specific rejection of certain aspects of past is not something that can be stated to be limited only to Dr. Ambedkar, but the force of the argument and the times were such that even those who were traditionally trained, and that too not just in any other part, but also in Purva Mimamsa, they were indeed, say, people who tried to think of a fresh dawn. And that fresh dawn is the sense in which this, it is in that context that say, छोड़ो कल की बातें, कल की बात पुरानी, नए दौर में लिखेंगे हम मिलकर नई कहानी, हम हिंदुस्तानी. This specific point does come in. So it is that context that cannot be missed. And I have brought to your attention the point of the sense in which Professor Ramchandra Gandhi has focused on untouchability as a shame of Advaita principle. And there is a second point that he also tried to make, that the original sense of untouchable is the Atman itself. So this was a point that he tried to formulate in his article. And that kind of a thinking indeed actually was taken further. And we have very recent scholarship that also tries to focus on this particular aspect. And the reason why, say, this becomes an important aspect to be discussed in the context of Rama Rājya, or a discussion on Rama Rājya, or a sense of past that that actually one carries, is because it's a commonly taught fact today in the entire country that in the past there was a heinous practice. It may not be something that can be traced to distant past, but certainly in the medieval ages that came about in the Indian environs, in the Indian territory, across the country, which has specifically to do with the sense of certain class of people as untouchables, and they are untouchables forever, and they have been untouchables forever since times immemorial. So such is a kind of a formulation that did come about, and this happens to be something that also gets taught to students through their history textbooks or through their other means, wherever, say, there are. And you'd find that, say, this sense is also deeply embedded in the manner in which we notice our own constitutional text. So I have pointed out that if untouchable and untouchability is taken to be in the sense of what Professor Ramchandra Gandhi has suggested in his revised version, where untouchability shall be defeated by quote-unquote untouchability, where the sense of untouchable is taken as Atman, and then there is a reference to everybody being equal in the sense of everyone is Atman, is a point from where he takes off. And as I stated, there are, say, latest versions of it that you would find under the writings of such scholars like Professor Sundar Sarukkai, and there are extensions of it which have also been published as recently as 2019. So those references and so on can be separately shared with you. But main point of bringing this to your attention is that that the current sense of past does indeed carry that there is a sense of heinous practice of yore in our society called untouchability, which it still is practiced in the country, and it is something which is a shame, and that is something that one must indeed shun. And for that, there is a call also that this can only be done when there is an annihilation of caste. So what is the manner in which this annihilation of caste can be done? Annihilation of caste is a pamphlet, is actually supposedly to be a specific speech that Dr. Ambedkar was required to deliver, but because of the radicality of what is proposed in it, it was not actually, in fact, that talk got cancelled, and later Dr. Ambedkar published it as a text. And it turns out that the fact that, say, it got published in 1936, and it also got a review by Mahatma Gandhi, and then there was an exchange between Dr. Ambedkar and Mahatma Gandhi, specifically on the kind of critique that, or the bitter critique that Dr. Ambedkar had on the Gandhian project, is something that begins with these exchanges publicly. So that part is something that we indeed have to see as part of understanding, say, where exactly does this question of trying to reject, or rather say, trying to completely erase any sense of past has to be seen. So this is something that becomes an important exercise of this specific aspect. The second point that also needs to be brought to your attention is the question of a specific suggestion which one of the participants in the course has pointed out, that at some point right after in the sense of the construction of the Rama Mandira, the foundation stone laying ceremony was to be conducted. At that time, there's a discussion on Rama Rājya and Rama Mandira that happened, in which Dr. Subramanya Swamy seems to have pointed out that Constitution of India is what, when followed appropriately, leads to Rama Rājya, and Dr. Ambedkar was a great Rama Bhakta. This was a point which was brought to your attention. So one of the key points that also finds that requires to be understood in this sequence is about what was the sense in which this can be understood. So there are indeed quite a few works of Dr. Ambedkar which has analyzed Ramayana, and not just analyzed but also critiqued it severely, and critiqued it from the formulation of the modern lens of liberty, equality, fraternity, these principles. And this critique is nowhere better found in the story that comes from Uttarakanda of Ramayana, which is the reference to a story of a person by name Shambhuka, who got killed by Rama as a part of his duty towards the king, duty as a king towards the kingdom. So this story and the kind of versions that have actually been told of this is a definite part of the understanding of what was the cruelty of Rama Rājya, according to a large set of people that say today would call themselves as Dalits. So this is a certain point that one indeed has to understand, and what is it that has been the response to this and the manner in which this entire story unfolded. So that again is a question that has to be kept in mind. So Shambhuka and the understanding of Shambhuka, and in what manner does Dr. Ambedkar see this? So one way in which indeed one can understand this formulation is that Dr. Ambedkar's entire exercise was actually grounded in a sense of compassion towards everybody. And that sense of compassion is something that he could not find in the Uttarakanda of Valmiki Ramayana, but he could indeed find that when one refers to Uttara Ramacharitam of Bhavabhuti, which is a very fine Sanskrit Nataka, one of the best Sanskrit Natakas that we find. So, in fact, Dr. Ambedkar is very fond of Bhavabhuti, so much so that he has quoted a specific shloka whose translation he gave in many of his writings. Bhavabhuti stated, "Time is infinite and earth is vast. Someday there will be born a man who will appreciate what I have said." So time is infinite, earth is vast. Someday there will be born a man somewhere on earth who will appreciate what I have said. So this is the sense in which, say, Dr. Ambedkar's attachment to Bhavabhuti is to be seen. And Bhavabhuti also discusses the important story of Shambhuka Vadha. So this is a question that we'll certainly take up this week as one of the key kind of exercises to understand in the context of a sense of past and the direction towards realizing Rama Rājya. So that is one part. And then the other point is about Purana. Apart from, say, the sense in which Purana as understood as Pura Apinavam Puranam, there's a Amarakosa clarification, in fact, an explanation and explication, which clearly says Puranam Panchalakshanam. There are 5 distinctive features which are to be present for something to be called a Purana. So one finds that if one opens various Puranas, one indeed finds that the sense of Purana that is described in Bhagavata Purana, one finds that there are 10 Lakshanas which are specified. But and in some Puranas, one may not even be able to locate what exactly are the ways in which these 5 Lakshanas are stated. But the Lakshanas that are given are these. The reference starts with Sarga, Pratisarga, Manvantara, Rajavamsha, and Vamsanucharita. So these are the 5 Lakshanas whose, when all these things are come together, that actually brings out what we call as a Purana. Now, it is important to as well say, observe what are these senses in which each of these terms are used, and also the sense of past that is actually captured by these 5 terms, and how they indeed impact our imagination across the board. So when one speaks of Sarga, the reference to Sarga is to the first creation that happens by Brahma, and this first creation happens on the seed of Ahankara. So Ahankara is the bija which actually brings about the Srishti Karya. So that Srishti is referred to as Sarga. And there is a reference to Pratisarga. The reference to Pratisarga is something that one also finds in the story of Matsyavatara. One finds the story of the Noah of Ark. The reference is also to be found there. The Pratisarga is a point where one actually has to locate the sense in which one has to start. So once the Ahankara Bija based Srishti, when it actually encounters Pralaya, which is a delusion, then there is a conscious effort made to try and preserve the seeds of the Srishti that happened And these seeds are protected so that once the pralaya recedes, the deluge, when it actually recedes, then there is a specific method by which regeneration is attempted. So this regenerated srishti is what is pratisarga. So srishti starting with ahankara bija, and the srishti which is following on the ahankara bija srishti, once there is a pralaya that happens, a deluge, that is the pratisarga. And once these two are clear, then the term manvantara, which we also came across as a time span, specifically in the time spans of cosmic time scales of Puranas, we would identify that the sense is captured when one looks at the point of each kalpa has 14 Manus, who are the first kings, and those who as well, whose progeny are the rest of the mankind that we know of. So each Manu is the one whose progeny survived till the end of that time period in which each Manu's children are present. That is what we would as well say treat up as a manvantara, whose timeline is actually given to be. That is, the reign of each Manu is something that is given in one manvantara. And we've already noticed that one manvantara is equivalent to 71 Mahayugas. So each Mahayuga is the correction of Krita, Treta, Dwapara, Kali. So this is the sequence that we have looked at. And the point is that when we have these overall formulations of 71 Mahayugas, within these Mahayugas, we have in each Krita, Treta, Kali, Dwapara, Kali, we have Chandravamsa and Suryavamsa kings. So the Chandravamsa, Suryavamsa kings, whose descendants and their stories, they are also present as part of Purana. And whoever are the kings who are the ones who reign during the Kali Yuga, their reference is also to be found, and this is part of Vamsancharita. So we have a specific count of all these 5, which makes up a Purana. Now, the sense of this Purana and the mapping on to what we know of as the history as on today has not actually been matched up specifically in the historical timelines. The historical timelines are also present during the Kali Yuga, whose origins are situated around 3101 to before the Common Era. So this, say, timeline starting from 3101 to before the Common Era to this time, we refer to as Kali Yuga, and most of the kind of stories that are captured during this first 3000 years, starting from 3101 to 101 BCE, the formulations that we get from modern history, they do not match up to the manner in which we look at the modern history. And one of the key senses in which we get to notice this is also the fine legend and the fine kind of a story that is created out of the most popular king as per the modern historians and the ideal king in Ashoka, and the formulation of Ashoka the Great as a specific kind of a referent that was taken up by historians to contrast it with Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great was somebody who primarily, say, went on a spree of great degree of violence in order to defeat their enemies, and he has tried to conquer the entire world. As a contrast to this, we have Ashoka, who is projected to be that king who initially starts off as a cruel king, as somebody who wages a very devastating war, and having raised and having actually, say, taken up a very devastating war, he retreats and he embraces the peaceful Buddhism, and then is keen on spreading this the word of Buddha, which is towards enhancing peace across the world. So he sends Bauddha bhikshus across the board, and that way the spread of Buddhism happened in the world. And we have noticed already that this is one of the prominent illustrations that we find also amongst the 22 illustrations of the Constitution of India. So Ashoka and this story of the renunciation of Ashoka's cruel behavior has been a remarkable kind of you could say in modern times a meme material. It is the manner in which one has portrayed the past in a beautiful imaginative story, and that story is something that can indeed be, say, carried forth to create a specific sense of past that indeed directs one to act in the mold of that particular imagination. It is a different story that of late we do have, say, several scholars who have come together who point out that this account that has been provided and projected isn't something that stands up to the kind of scrutiny based on the evidences that are available, because it is pointed out that Ashoka has embraced Buddhism much before he has waged a war on Kalinga. And his war on Kalinga, having brought about a transformation, is a fine imagination for people, but there are instances to show that even after he dispatched the Bauddha bhikshus to different parts of the world, you would indeed find that he also was he exercised his rule and his power as a king to punish, and there are, say, records that indeed show this. So this is again something that you find is in the current public space understanding of Ashoka, and the revisiting of Ashoka as the ideal king and as Ashoka the Great. It's a very important point to notice that Ashoka has been picked up as a very important anchor point for modern history, because modern history indeed calls for specific attention to the material evidences that are to be found in the world. And what are material evidences? One can find material evidences in the form of archaeological remains or epigraphic records or coins of the era, so numismatics. So these are the kind of sources which give the substance to claim that this indeed happened. So Ashoka is accepted as a historical being because there are several of these accounts of his which we still very proudly refer to. So we also know that the Sarnath capital is actually on top of an Ashokan pillar. And one finds that, say, these pillars have inscriptions of later kings as well to indicate how they actually treated these with great kind of importance. And even the fact that, say, these pillars and the edicts have been found as far as Afghanistan, current day Afghanistan, and to down south in Karnataka. So the vastness of this has also indicated that all of what we would call as Akhanda Bharata today was something that was under the reign of Ashoka. So such is the kind of formulation within which, say, we have been repeatedly told about the sense of the reign of Ashoka. So this formulation is something that one does not find any great reference to in Purana as an important, as a great ruler, great king. Such is not a reference that one finds in the Kali Yuga king's story. So that is a very important observation to be kept in mind. Whereas while, say, the grandfather of Ashoka, the founder of Mauryan dynasty, Chandragupta Maurya, we do not have any kind of specific archaeological records that can be stated to be belonging to Chandragupta Maurya. So that Chandragupta Maurya's archaeological remains are not found, yet he has been accepted because there are these dynastic lineages which have been specified in Puranas, which have been accepted as historical. And this form of accepting the lineages as historical underwent a very interesting kind of reading of these source materials by historians, which requires to be understood to understand the antagonism that one can as well claim as Purana Vaira. That Purana Vaira is very specific to this form of Puranam Panchalakshanam, the sense in which I have just formulated and brought to your attention. That has indeed been say, violated, and an antagonism of it has been clearly shown in the manner in which, say, the lineages have been accepted by modern historians, and the manner in which, say, the evidences which are actually present, how they have been retrofitted. There is a very fine imagery that one gets from Greek thought. There's a person by name Procrustes who had a bed, and he was somebody who had this habit of laying people on his bed, and if they are shorter than the bed, he used his full force to stretch them to fit the bed. And if you are actually longer than the bed, then, say, whatever part is longer than the bed, those parts are chopped off. So Procrustean bed and the Procrustean fit is a certain usage that we have. So the exercise that happened with respect to the picking up of dynastic lineages from Puranas and fitting them to choose the kind of archaeological evidences that are actually present. So this exercise happened in such a manner that in order to ensure that whatever are the archaeological evidences that are located, even the archaeological evidences which are obtained, they must be interpreted, they must be imagined to actually be in a certain context. So that imagination was so constrained that it had to necessarily violate whatever is actually given in the Puranas. If at all we had a formulation that said, well, this is what I find here, this is what I find in archaeology, this is what I find in this, and I find it difficult to actually reconcile these two, then there is that there is a certain degree of say, honesty in terms of specifying it. And you do find that, say, in the initial days when this started, there are certain proposals which were given, and those proposals over time, because of the precedence of the erstwhile scholar who has studied it and has given a certain proposal, that proposal gets accepted as a point of accepted fact for future. So this has happened not just in one instance, but it has happened across the board when it comes to, say, the ancient Indian history is concerned. So that way, that has been a great bone of contention, and it still remains a great bone of contention. So in this state of affairs, in what manner can, say, one address this point has been a great degree of struggle that one finds between modern historians on one side and those who would, amongst modern historians also, of the various strands of modern historians. So in what manner this entire thing happened has been very finely captured by Professor Viśvaprasanna Pathak, whose say, reference I have indeed mentioned as part of the course beginning itself, as part of the course's the background note. So Professor Viśvaprasanna Pathak has an essay called Search for an Identity, where he indeed describes this in great detail. And that's something that I shall share for your further reference, and also to understand what happened in terms of the approach to history and the lack of an Indian approach to historiography, the manner in which history gets written. So these are points which clearly indicate that the kind of material that we have and the manner in which the materials like Puranas need to be understood, that hasn't been properly, say, captured. So what exactly makes Purana of the Panchalakshana kind not acceptable to modern world? One reason is that we do not have the kind of influence of the various kings who have expanded their own influence beyond the territory of India, and the kind of ways and means by which one can identify their presence in different parts of the world as we know it today. We do find, of course, there are certain banned books where, like, for example, Edward Pocock has written a book called India in Greece. And in such a book, he actually points out to several kinds of names that one finds in the various the current names of places. And Edward Pocock goes on to do a linguistic analysis and claim that each of these names which are found to places, they would have meant something for people in those days. So can we trace the meaning of these names in the languages that are in vogue right now, or the classical languages of Europe, either it be Latin or Greek? And he points out that one cannot possibly, say, find this relation easily. But if one picks Sanskrit, then these names and their meanings do have some correlation, and that way it also indicates certain kind of connection, and we seem to make some sense of these names. So for example, say a place like Scandinavia, and the term Skanda from Puranas, from Sanskrit, they are actually brought together. So India and Greece was a proposal. So you do find such a kind of a work, and you also find another reference to one person by name Chamanlal, who wrote a book called Hindu America, where the point of what are the kind of references to the pre-Christ era, that is before the Christ era, what are the kinds of the kind of archaeological remains, as well as the names of the places and how they align with, say, what is present in Puranas. Now these books that I am speaking of, they are not part of the standard manner in which one can understand the way in which world and world history is understood. Why, for that matter, one could even speak of the great controversy that people speak of in terms of Aryan invasion theory, which has now become Aryan migration theory, and the counter to it in terms of the autochthonous theory or the out of India theory. So this, say, debate actually goes back to the question of whether one can indeed write a world history by actually keeping India as the anchor point. And in what manner does actually one can go about doing it? Now, this is a question which hasn't been addressed by Indians very strongly, and that indeed causes a big problem. So Michael Witzel, one of the very important proponents of Aryan migration theory, if not Aryan invasion theory, he specifically says, well, if at all the autochthonous theory has to hold, then the entire world history as we know it today has to be altered. So we do not have a complete accounting of it present as on today. So therefore, say, till that time, one cannot actually make a sense of this particular thing properly. That is to say that whatever are the various kinds of archaeological or epigraphic or similar kinds of records that have been obtained till now, over the past 300 years or so, when the conscious attempt at writing aggregate histories happened in the world. Earlier times, say, we never had any kind of a history which said history of this vast territory. You might as well have history of a specific dynasty or a specific place that is known to people who are belonging to that place. Or you might have an instance of one's own family tree and the stories that are associated with family trees. But the very idea of collecting various family trees or various stories which are associated with the people of a place, collecting them, collating them, and also reasoning over each of those, trying to make a coherent sense of the entire account and to write it as a history. This is a very modern exercise. This did not actually happen, and people did not find a necessity to do that also, because why would I have to know about, say, what happened in somewhere at a distance which is not directly connected with me? There weren't the kind of reasons or a necessity for one to look at aggregate histories, but the expansion of the understanding about the world and whatever was the earlier sense of appreciation of the world being altered specifically to think of territoriality as well as the sense of one-upmanship that one had to indeed bring about. This indeed, say, brought about reasons for people to create an aggregate history. So aggregation as a process itself is quite a new thing. And this aggregation, which happened over the past 300 or so years, which found its best expression in the wonderful work by Edward Gibbon on the rise and fall of Roman Empire, the decline of the Roman Empire, which he wrote in many volumes. That actually was a very fine kind of a specimen writing of how history ought to be, aggregate history ought to be, which actually made an effort to collect various sources, bring them together, collate, and write into a coherent kind of account. On that count, one might as well point out that, say, Kalhana wrote a work called Kashmir Rajatarangini. But the key point about Rajatarangini turns out that the manner in which it is written and the manner in which we notice the senses in which this is to be understood are again much different. So many of the points which are mentioned in Rajatarangini, they are not again taken in toto. They are not taken as is, even though many historians would say that he did have a critical eye of a modern historian in terms of how to read and how to interpret materials that is actually brought to one's attention. So this itself creates a big mess. And to go back to what Professor Michael Witzel has to say, he says that since we do not have any world history that actually accounts for the autochthonous theory and also the materials that we have do not match. And if and when there is a complete treatment of all the various things that happen in the world in the light of this, then we shall see whether, say, this theory can be accepted or not. So that's a very, it's a methodological point, and it's also a point which is something that gives a task ahead. If one were to as well convince somebody who currently, say, vouches for Aryan migration theory, because he categorically said that if I were to alter this position, then I would have to indeed change all that is actually written until now. And that is something which is like revising all that exists is as good as saying that I am giving up on all the kind of inheritance of these thoughts that I have carried over the past so many years, which is not something that I would like to give up. So it's a very fair and square argument on that count. Now that only poses a question about, say, how at all one would indeed try to make sense of why go about, say, thinking about beyond, say, Kali Yuga. I'm still referring to, say, Kali Yuga in the Puranic sense, and how does one indeed try to, say, put all these in terms of the historical timeline that we have. So that exercise is a major exercise which hasn't yet been taken up, which is one important reason why we find that when Puranas are actually referred to in the modern sense, they would actually be treated as myths. And this ideation of myths, there is a positive sense in which one can use the term myth when one indeed says that there's the myth actually conveys certain truths of reality. But that sense of trying to look at these mythical stories in that formulation is also something that one does not find is a point which actively is conveyed across to people over the past, let's say, post-independent era is concerned. We do find that there are several, say, Purana Pravachanakaras who might narrate these stories, but the manner in which these stories are narrated, they'll find only few instances where modern people can also relate to the kind of reasoning which is present within it. So to understand, say, how the story of Purana, though it has happened at a long time before, yet it becomes new, one should be able to as well invoke that in terms of our day-to-day life and living. When that kind of an imagination exists, then possibly one can say that, yes, it is something that is indeed making sense. And when that sense of past about how these stories are indeed relevant to me in the current times is not actually addressed, then we are in a position where these become stories of yore, which those who are interested might actually read through, but there is no conscious attempt of trying to see whether that memory can indeed help me today. I'll give you a couple of instances where my own study has brought me to look at their relevance right away. So one instance happened when Swami Gyanswarup was fasting, and he was indeed, say, his final letter was written to the President of India also. It was copied to President of India, though it was sent to Prime Minister of India also. I hope, say, you are aware of this scholarly saint, Swami Gyanswarup, who fasted unto death for the protection of Ganga and to preserve the pristine state of flows on Ganga in the source rivers of the Ganga in the Uttarakhand region. So his letter, though it was posted to the head of the state, President of India, one could not, and even if, say, there was a conscious attempt made, one could not actually, say, get any kind of a response till, of course, say, the man was lifted and forcibly joined in a hospital. So this has come to a state of affairs, and there's also a point that one gets to notice that Dr. Ambedkar says that fasting unto death or being on a satyagraha these are actually not constitutional modes of trying to address the kind of issues that may come in modern times. So this is part of the same lecture that I have actually brought to your attention that happened in the Constituent Assembly. So if one reads through, he does point out that in the final speech that he delivers to the Constitution in the Constituent Assembly, there was a very categorical point that he makes, and that point is that we cannot have people who can actually enforce their opinions onto rest of the people, and for that reason, it is essentially undemocratic in its nature to have someone who says that if you do not do this, then I'll give up my life by fasting unto death. So there is a point in terms of what is being said. So Talhana's Rajatarangini has a very interesting excerpt where one finds that this exercise of somebody fasting unto death is something that is not a new story in India. It has great past, and it's a practice that came down to us since very ancient times. And there is a specific reference to a Raja in Kashmir who had an officer, and the officer was called Prayopaveshadhikrit. That is, if in case there is somebody who says that what's the point of my living when I'm not getting justice, and he goes on a fast unto death, then this specific officer, he has a duty to summon the person who is actually made a vow to fast unto death till he gets the relief that he is seeking. This man is actually brought to the king directly, and king is a sovereign. So as a sovereign, it was the responsibility of the king to as well understand what was the kind of issue that made him take this extreme step of thinking of giving up one's life. And in the process, he addressed the issue, and correspondingly he used to resolve the case. In our times, of course, we do not have any kind of a resolution, because our sense of the sovereign is not even the same as the sense of the sovereign that is actually there of yore. So how do we as well ensure that a kind of such a authority which can indeed take serious attention to important issues like this, where the sovereignty is invoked in order to address important aspects, or at least bring to attention, not just in terms of the kind of person and the sovereign alone, but if it is actually relating to an entire country and the kind of spirit that is spoken of, how at all can one indeed bring that to attention? So do we have mechanisms for that? As on today, the constitution does not actually provide for such kind of a specific structure, because to be constitutional means that utilizing the structures which are provided or prevalent within the framework of the constitution to actually raise issues. So what would that mean? It would mean that if I am from Hyderabad, then if I have an issue, then I should go to the member of parliament from Hyderabad, seek his help in terms of raising the issue that I have in the legislative or the parliamentary house in parliament, in the and correspondingly get my voice get represented through the representative, and through that get my action done. So this may not be always possible, and there may be instances where one might indeed not face an instance of or even a possibility of justice brought to the fore. So how would one actually address such scenarios? This is a case not just in terms of this point, but let's say in Dr. Ambedkar's instance of trying to seek out equality, was there a possibility in which he could address the question that he is actually seeking out? So The point was there are times when we notice that because of the changes that happened in the manner in which the British rule brought about the change of access to resources with respect to various communities, access to resources which was earlier present has been erased from memory. That meant necessarily that certain communities were at the mercy of the others, whereas certain other communities who still preserved their respective sources, they are actually found to be indeed following the erstwhile practices, end up creating a scenario where injustice is prevalent, because if you have a village within which there is a single source of water and it is held by only a certain set of people and not the other set, then we indeed have a problem. So that is something that has to be, say, understood in that context, which we today have, but not in others. So this is an important aspect to as well understand the scenarios in which we have been placed, and that sense of past which was existent earlier, and how the lack of that sense of past might as well have created the kind of desire for an abstract sense of quality called abstract sense of equality that is actually sought after. So before we understand these changes that happened, one indeed have to say look back at these issues. So I'd actually say stop for a while to yeah, I thought I'd take a couple of questions before say if there are anything. Otherwise, I'd say move further in terms of going to specific point of Shambhukavadha, with which we'd say bring this today's session to a close. All right, so let me give you, say, the story of Shambhukavadha in short. So in the Dharmashastras, we have a clear specification of 4 varnas, of which the first 3 are also referred to as dvijas, and the 4th one is non-dvija. So the formulation of claiming that dvijatva, so the first question for somebody who is seeking equality would be that why is there non-dvijatva for Shudras amongst the 4 varnas? Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. So this was the question that one finds, which was posed by Dr. Ambedkar. And I have brought to your attention that there was this fine way in which Paraloka has been brought to one's attention by Professor Navjyoti Singh, when he said that the way in which we need to understand Paraloka need not be thought of as something which is distant, but it could indeed be seen as something that is in the minds of the memories of people about people who are not right in front of them, whether alive or who passed away. The manner in which we speak of them in public space is what constitutes a paraloka. So this same formulation can be extended to that of the important notion of dvijatva and the sense of equality. And this was a move that Professor Navjyoti Singh made, and whether or not one indeed has a point where the Shastra accepts it. But notice that, say, the sense of this formulation indeed gives dvijatva for Shudra as well, where the Shudra's dvijatva or rebirth and the career in Paraloka starts the moment when he certainly does something which somebody remembers, and remembers in his absence and also long after the person is dead and gone. Are there such instances of people of yore or of people in the present that we find in the world that whose memories are still carried for the kind of exceptional kind of deeds that they did, and it could be a deed of service as well? You would find that there are so many stories that one can relate to. So if this question of dvijatva is understood in this formulation, then there is a way by which one can indeed find a sense of relating to the sense of how one finds the formulation in the Shastra. May not be accurately, but certainly something that gives us a starting point. So that is one point that I did want to bring to your attention. On a second note, so this is one suggestion, but there are, say, further other aspects that require to be discussed, we'll come to. So second point was Shudra was not someone who ought to perform a yajna that is meant for a Kshatriya or a Brahmana or a Vaishya. Now, this is also understandable when one says that each one has a different sort of yajna. It's a sense by which one can indeed say speak of a different sense of equality, and this different sense of equality, some people have called it as complex equality. So they said that one might indeed have a sense where there may be people belonging to different kinds, and each of them strive in their own different manners. But eventually, if they are going to get the same kind of a fruit, then such a kind of a thing is not simple equality that we expect, where everybody has to do same kind of task to actually attain the same kind of a goal or same kind of a fruit. But this would be a sense of what would be treated as a complex equality. So the equality question does indeed have, say, some very interesting kind of formulations, as well as the senses in which one can pose these. And in the specific instance of Shambhuka Vadha, Shambhuka was a Shudra who performed the yajna, and the object of his yajna was that he wanted to get to Swarga with his own body, which is mortal body. That is, he expected to do such a kind of a propitiation of gods that would actually rise the body of the person from where he is and lift him up to the stage of this Swargaloka. This was the kind of a desire with which Shambhuka initiated his yajna. So what has been the result of it? And it is actually something that is from where the story begins. So in Rama Rājya, one of the features of Rama Rājya, probably a very important feature that one should never forget, is that Rama Rājya is one in which there are no premature deaths. There is nobody who is ever orphaned, and nobody who ever has a premature death. So such is the kind of and that is the sense in which we find that, say, you would never find any widows in the Rama Rājya. So the possibility of such a thing is directly linked with the question of premature death, and the possibility of a premature death ever occurring in Rama Rājya is never present. So one of the features that one can necessarily associate with Rama Rājya is that of no premature death. Now this is a principle where, since we have already discussed about the question of death and its being beyond, say, the complete understanding of human being, though of course we find that people like Yuval Noah Harari indeed want to consider a possibility of looking at human strength which makes them overcome death and embrace immortality. That's still some time away. So if we have to deal with, say, the present circumstances in which we are in, one must indeed accept that, say, there are so many instances of premature deaths, specifically in terms of the pandemic that we are experiencing. We find so many instances. And if one were to ask a question, what is the responsibility that the government of the day or government of the world, if such a thing exists, what would it actually take as its responsibility towards a premature death? This is a question which one finds, say, several very interesting answers in modern times. For example, say if one finds accident happen, let's say a train accident happens and many people die. It's certainly, say, death which is not desired, and it's something which is premature death for many people who may be very young in their age. So what is it that the government does? Government takes responsibility to this extent that it thinks of offering compensation to the lost lives to those people who are alive, so that such a compensation can possibly, say, create a kind of alleviation of the pain that is caused because of the loss of person. And these persons may also be the breadwinners for their respective families and so on. So such is the kind of current day response that we find, not just in India, but maybe, say, across the world. So the sense of responsibility gets limited only to this extent of trying to alleviate the kind of pain that a person finds. And there are, say, the senses in which, say, one alleviates the pain of somebody who has encountered a premature death in one's own family. This happens to be a very interesting thematic that one finds several stories within Indian writings, that each of those stories actually indicates a very fine insight that requires to be understood. So in fact, say, there is a work called Chitra Lakshana, which takes this very simple, very same structure and speaks of a king by name Bayajit, who fights a war against Yamadharmaraja, and in order to bring back the life of one of his kingdom, one of his people, because the death was premature, and there is no reason why there should be a premature death, because he has governed his kingdom by upholding dharma in all manners possible. So there is a metaphysical element also, that if at all you have a Rajya which is ruled with full force of dharma, and dharma is something that is standing on all its senses, on all its legs, then there should not be a premature death. So in Rama Rājya, there was a premature death, and there was a Brahmana who came forward and accused the king Rama that how could it be that in your kingdom there's something which happened which actually resulted in the death of my 5-year-old young boy. So it is this death that actually makes Rama send all kinds of there's a lot of activity to try and identify where exactly have they gone wrong, what exactly has happened which resulted in the death of premature death of this young boy, and how is it that one can indeed bring back the life of this person who is dead. So the talk of, say, bringing back the life of this death is also true of the Chitralakshana story, where it is done in a different way. It is actually a story which is conveyed as the birth of painting. So in the absence of the boy who is alive, you give the painted full picture of the boy who died, and that way the memory is restored for the father who lost his child. So the birth of painting on earth and this story of a premature death got connected in that work. So that's something that is an interesting and fascinating story. So to get back to the story of Shambhuka, the premature death meant that several spies were sent, and Rama himself went out to try and locate what exactly caused this. So the Brahmana said that one kind of a possibility why this would happen is somebody is performing a yajna, somebody is performing a specific kind of a ritual which is not appropriate as per Shastras. So when such a thing happens, then it would result in the premature death of a person. So this was a thing which they gave as a generic principle. Now that meant to identify who is the one who has actually done and what is the kind of sankalpa with which, say, this ritual is being performed. And in the process, Rama himself identified Shambhuka, and Shambhuka was slain for his say transgression of performing a yajna which was against the principles of Shastra. Now, the modern day recollection and the kind of commentary on this particular thing has directly taken on the point of dvijatva of or non-dvijatva of Shudra, and the complaint that Brahmanas have actually done against this man and associated this this kind of charge on a Shudra for having performed yajna in order to rise up to Swarga is something that requires to be understood as a claim to gaining one-upmanship over Shudras. So this is the kind of a specific structure of an argument that one finds. So one could possibly take this on face value, and there are indeed many people who take this on face value. We find very good intellectuals like Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta, one of the top intellectuals, public intellectuals of our country, who point out that Shambhuka, killing Shambhuka was injustice, killing Vali was injustice, what was done to Sita is injustice. But you are Rama, you are somebody who is beyond, beyond, say, normal human beings. So you could indeed, say, redeem by actually getting redemption for Shambhuka. Because of your killing Shambhuka, he rose to heavens. So how did he rise to heavens? He rose in his subtle form, not in his gross form, not in his gross body. The entire formulation and the effort of Shambhuka was that he rise with the gross body to heavens, for which he got killed. Now, the question of equality that is actually discussed in this requires a very fine contrast. Do we find any other story within Ramayana or, say, Puranas where a similar kind of a endeavor which was done by somebody other than a Shudra, has it actually found a very similar kind of a result? That's a insightful kind of a line of inquiry, and indeed, it indeed turns out that, say, there is this story of Trishanku, who also desired the same thing, and that so the desire of Trishanku was that please perform a ritual for me so that I can go to the heavens with my own body. So this was a request that he asked Vasishta, his guru. Trishanku was one of the ancestors of Rama. And the son of Trishanku is the famous Raja Harishchandra, who we all know as Satya Harishchandra. So Trishanku asked for this, and Vasishta said that is not possible. What has actually made you ask for this? It is something which is a kind of effort which is dangerous and something that should never be undertaken. So insistent as he was, because of the deep desire that he had, Trishanku said, well, I intend to pursue this, come what may. So if not you, I'll actually go and ask somebody else. So he went and asked the sons of Vasishta, and they also were angered. Then he went back to Vasishta and said, you seem to be thinking that you are the only one who can perform this. I'll go and find some other Rohita who would as well get me this thing done. So that angered sage Vasishta, and he cursed Trishanku to become a Chandala. Chandala is a specific term that one finds where he who is the one who keeps the smashana, burial ground, the space where we have the funeral ground, that person is Chandala, and he is certainly treated as an untouchable. And that sense of untouchable is again a point which has to do with, say, the rituals of post-death that are included, where we find that, say, that sense of untouchability is something that is present insofar as a certain degree of number of days for each family belonging to different varnas. Specifically, there are things which are specified, which one does find in terms of our own shastras. So, question comes back to Trishanku, who was actually asked, who was cursed to become a Chandala. So he finds some way. In fact, this is a story that comes from Devi Bhagavatam, where because of the grace of Jagannatha, he gets restored to his position as a king. So this is not the first time, but in fact, 2-3 times this thing repeats over. So there are, say, these very many instances that require, say, very interesting story of Trishanku that requires, say, to be seen. To notice that all that it indicates points out to the point that the sense of people thinking of rising to next world, which is for higher world, with the mortal body that one has, is a principle that does not hold. And that not holding and being desired shall be treated with the same kind of disdain, whether it be a Kshatriya or a Shudra. So if this is a formulation, then comes the next point that Dr. Ambedkar likes. So here comes the, say, next move that one might as well see. So Dr. Ambedkar asks the question, who are the Shudras? And he takes Trishanku's story and says that Shudras or Ati Shudras, the Panchamas, they are the ones who are such kind of Kshatriyas who have actually gone against the word of the Shastra, which actually is the word of the Brahmana. So this is the formulation with which an entire class of Shudras got created, is the manner in which Dr. Ambedkar presents a very fine construction, which one indeed finds that, say, there are quite a few scholars who have countered it, who have found logical flaws in this, and that is written. But this is part of the sense of past of a large number of people who would call themselves as Dalits as on today. Now, I'd close this by bringing to this reference of Dr. Ambedkar as Rama Bhakta. So, as I pointed out, Bhavabhuti was a favorite poet for Dr. Ambedkar. So Dr. Ambedkar has made a very interesting observation. If one looks at Uttar Ramacharita, Rama is actually pained that he has to exercise his cruel danda. And you find a beautiful shloka in there also. One can refer to those. In fact, the entire text of Uttar Ramacharita, it makes a very important statement also. Eko rasaha karuna eva, where karuna rasa is given great prominence by Bhavabhuti. So that sense in which Rama's karuna rasa, which overwhelms him, even as he has to do the harsh task of beheading Shambhuka as a matter of his duty as a king, is pointed to. And that very moment, Shambhuka rises, there are people from the heavens who take him in a celestial chariot, and Shambhuka then reveals to Rama where exactly he can find Sita. So this is the story from Uttaramcharitam of Bhavabhuti. And Dr. Ambedkar finds it a very fine, acceptable kind of way in which one treats. What else can Rama do if the Shastras say that one indeed has to kill if a Shudra is performing yajna, and that to achieve something which is what Shastras do not imagine. Don't we have, say, like Yuval Noah Harari says, don't we have indeed a kind of a desire and also a kind of free will to make such choices so as to take up such a kind of an endeavor, which may be, say, banned or may be stated to be, say, to be avoided, but don't people have the kind of an open ground for liberty to engage in such tasks? So to force people is basically something that goes back to the medieval Christian Catholic Church's formulation, and such a thing necessarily must be shunned. So it doesn't hold in the light of, say, the modern world that we intend to be part of. So to have such a kind of restriction itself is false. And since Rama, the good king that he is, he could not ever say no to whatever is the kind of existent law that is there, because he upholds law, and he is someone who does it to the best of his ability, and his ability is also not something which is meek. So he cannot but do what he did. So where exactly is the problem? The problem was not with Rama. So the problem must be with, say, the Shastra itself. So what was Dr. Ambedkar's next move? Burn the Shastras. So this is something that we find is not a story. This is that is just a matter of an analysis that I am presenting to you right now as a reconstruction alone. But that is something that is, say, practiced in different parts of the country by several people who carries this formulation of how to see the very story of Ramayana, or many stories that come from Puranas. One would be surprised to note that, say, more than the Savarnas, or those who are part of the Trivarnikas, Brahmana, Kshatriya and Shudra, there is an extensive study of the Puranas that is being done by those who call themselves as Dalits today. That Dalit literature indeed reflects this is a very fascinating kind of a point that one notices. And they are also ready to rewrite their own respective stories and formulate what futures can be in order to seek what they treat as the just stay of their own existence in the world today. So the sense of understanding Purana and the manner in which one indeed tries to relate to Purana, and that which is also the sense of antagonism towards Purana, these are not something which are just matters of an academic study, but they are indeed having a great degree of present connotation in terms of actions that are performed by people. So the sense of past that we speak of is something that is operative in terms of the nature of our own, say, regular day-to-day deeds, and the kind of activities that we do is something that cannot be missed to notice that there are others who have their own respective sense of past, which is built on these grounds. So if we are to indeed talk of Rama Rājya, which speaks of the sense of Rama Rājya, where the nuances of the different types of bodies, and the sense of a Paraloka, and the sense of, say, Dvijatva, and the formulations within, say, the scope of Dvijatva that do come in, all these are matters, and including the very idea of the term Varna, and how, say, one understands caste and the annihilation of caste that Dr. Ambedkar speaks of, these do require, say, due reflection for us to understand the kind of tensions and the kind of, let's say, the points of, say, these are indeed points where one finds a great sense of conflict points that are there in the world as on today. So it is in this light that I would like to point to you that when Dr. Ambedkar speaks of annihilation of caste, the best way to speak of annihilation of caste, according to him, was that because caste is a structure that is built based on the exogamy and endogamy of a particular kind. So exogamy is marrying outside. So you marry outside one's gotra. There's a specific reference to gotra, which is a part of one's identity. And the second part is the endogamy with respect to one's varna. So this structure of marriage that is present is what comes up with what we call as caste, was a definition that Dr. Ambedkar gave. And in that sense, say, there's a great agreement between the sense of how varna is understood and how caste is understood. So the annihilation of caste for Dr. Ambedkar meant that one needs to actually look for intercaste marriages and encourage such kind of say marriages which would indeed say transgress whatever are the rules that are present in the Shastra. Already the quest of burning the Shastras was pointed out, because Rama as a Raja may be good, but the kind of grounds on which he is being raised, that is wrong. So therefore, say, we want Rama as the Raja, but not with the kind of laws that are risen. And that laws must be in the formulation of the modern constitution. And thus comes the formulation of Rama Rājya of the Ambedkarite kind, which Dr. Subramanian Swamy has spoken of, which indeed would necessarily miss out on the subtleties that one would indeed look at the Shastras. So that calls for, say, due reflection as a part of exercising our own conscious thoughts on the point of what is sense of past that is towards realizing Rama Rājya. So with this, I'd like to bring this session to a close. Any questions that are there, I'd be glad to answer. So if there aren't any questions, then we can as well say start our say we'll meet tomorrow at the same time, 5:30, and I'd continue with, say, some of these thoughts that are raised in here, and specifically deal with some more details about the sense in which Purana is understood today, and how can one actually refer to that which is old and at the same time new. That sense can be captured and one can move beyond the antagonism towards Puranas. Ram Ram.
Thank you.